Hello, welcome to History B. This week we're going to put everything together by looking at an example essay like we did last week, and we will assess this example essay against the assessment criteria for the exam. I hope you find it useful. Now, just to refresh your memory, your History B exam is to write an essay in class under exam conditions. You can bring in a 100-word prompt with you and a bibliography. The essay must have in-text referencing and should be between 1,200 to 1,600 words. You have 100 minutes to write it under exam conditions, and the exam will be on the 29th of June in Building D, Room 511 at 3 p.m. The essay you write will be about continuity and change and the interaction of groups. Now, I'll just go through the essay structure again to refresh your memory. This is an academic essay, so it must have an introduction and conclusion. Your first paragraph after the introduction should be about the historical context. The second paragraph would be the definition of the issue, which in this case is the interaction of groups. Then you write 2 or 3 paragraphs about change in your historical context, and then 1 or 2 paragraphs about continuity in the historical context. The key words really are continuity and change. So you must make it very clear that you are discussing continuity and change and the causes of the continuity and change and the interaction of the groups in your historical context. So let's look at an example. This is an example that a student wrote last year, and it scored very highly. The essay was about the English Civil War and the restoration of the monarchy after the English Civil War. If you're not familiar with the English Civil War, basically it was in the 1600s, and a group of Puritans, which are strict Protestants, rebelled against the English king, who was Charles I. The Puritans were led by Oliver Cromwell, and I've got them, Oliver Cromwell, and the king at the time was Charles I. The Puritans won the war, and for a short period of time, for a few years, England was ruled by a parliament rather than by a king. Charles I had his head chopped off by the parliament, and there was parliamentary rule under Oliver Cromwell until his death. After Cromwell died, Charles I's son, Charles II, came back to the throne and England became a monarchy again. So, the essay this student wrote was about the English Civil War and the restoration of the monarchy, continuity and change during the period, and the interaction of 2 groups, the monarchists and the parliamentarians, or the Puritans. This was the introduction. The English Interregnum, 1649 to 1660, and Restoration, 1660s, presents a distinct period of socio-economic change and political, institutional and cultural continuity. The relationship between the lower gentry-led parliamentarians and the aristocracy-led royalist groups would prove crucial in defining these changes in economic and social structures and compelling the trajectory for political continuity in English history. This is a good introduction because it defines the historical context. The interregnum is actually the rule of Parliament, and the restoration is the restoration of the monarchy. So we know that the author is clearly talking about this period of time. They mention change and continuity, and also make it clear that they're talking about the parliamentarians and the aristocracy. Okay? It's a very short but very good introduction. The next paragraph is about historical context, and basically the author talks about the period leading up to the historical context he's defined in the introduction. So I'll read it to you. The period preceding the English Civil War had been one of substantial economic shift. The years following Elizabeth I's victory over the Spanish Armada, 1588, had revolutionised the economic prospects of the merchant classes. Hill, 1972. New opportunities for trade and self-reliant industry had shifted economic systems from feudal to modern. This economic change had allowed for the rise of a devout Puritan section of the lower gentry, which in turn would fuel an animosity with the aristocracy. Carlin, 1980. The declining concentration, wealth retention in agricultural communities would establish the belligerence between a declining high church aristocracy and growing lower gentry. Carlin, 1980. It is through this belligerence in socio-economic interests that much of the ensuing period of change and continuity of political and social structures would be influenced. So this is a good paragraph because it gives a background to the period that's going to be discussed. It relates the past to the era that the author will discuss, and it has in-text referencing, and it also refers to the two groups. I will now discuss some of the change paragraphs that the author has written in their essay. This is not the entire essay. I'm just giving you some examples of some of the paragraphs about change that the author has written. This first change regards the English Civil War. It outlines the change and talks about the relationship between the groups. The war's outbreak would naturally separate its side along that divide. Charles I's attempts to dissolve Parliament for their refusal to fund a war on Scottish Covenanters had prompted lower gentry members into war against the king. The aristocracy at the time, having little influence over politics, would naturally side with the king to protect the legitimacy of their feudal landholdings. The war represented a significant change in which the social classes saw themselves, as for the first time in history a newly empowered middle class had refuted the divine right of kings. With parliamentary victory in 1649 at the Battle of Marston Moor, the war's outcome would secure the influence of the deeply Puritan parliamentarian faction. So the event was the Civil War, and the change is a significant change in the way in which social classes saw themselves. Okay, and then it talks about the parliamentarian victory, and it clearly outlines that it was an interaction between the groups. Another change that the author discusses in the essay is the change of parliamentary rule. So England changed from becoming an absolute monarchy to becoming a country ruled by Parliament without a king. The ensuing interregnum would introduce a number of policies to shape the continuing socio-economic change in England. Following Charles I's execution in 1649, the succeeding Rump Parliament would further pursue the interests of developing an early system of English capitalism that had prompted the bourgeois revolution, Carlin, 1980. Most prominently was the creation of the Commission of Trade in 1650, which would introduce new policies to expand the global trading potential of English merchants, Gardner, 1906. So the event is parliamentary rule, and the change is socio-economic changes, namely the rise of a merchant middle class. And it refers to the interaction between the groups with Charles I's execution and the Rump Parliament. As I said, this is not the whole essay. I'm just outlining certain bits of the essay. There are several other paragraphs regarding change. And then the author talks about continuity. The author talks about continuity in relation to the restoration of the monarchy. Okay. The period of restoration would also serve to ensure that Anglicanism would continue as a state religion in England. The reversal of Puritan laws and rejection of Catholicism would make this continuity possible, with the Anglican upper classes spearheading the restrictions on dissident religious denominations. Gardner, 1905. This remained so even after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, in which William III overthrew the Catholic converted James II and ended the Stuart dynasty with the assured continuity of a Protestant ascendancy. So they talk about how the Restoration, which is the event, ensued the continuity of the Anglican Church. And in the second continuity paragraph, the author talks about the continuing influence of the aristocracy after the Restoration. The aristocracy's influence in securing the continuity of the monarchy's cultural and religious institutions would ensure that they themselves would remain relevant to the social structure for centuries to come. Although the ensuing centuries would witness their general decline relative to the rising middle classes, the substantial wealth and influence of barons, earls, and the like would remain for centuries, as according to Hill, the aristocracy would continue to elevate themselves in society, still holding the majority of land and domestic produce and occupying some of the highest offices in governance and war. Hill, 1970. Even throughout the Enlightenment and the Whig supremacy of the 18th century, the Restoration would prove that the upper classes would continue to stand above the middle and lower spectrum well until the early 20th century. So he talks about the Restoration, and the continuity is the influence of the aristocracy. Now, as this is an academic essay, there is a conclusion, as there has to be. The conclusion starts with in conclusion. It talks about change and continuity. In conclusion, the period surrounding the English Civil War and interregnum produced substantial aspects of class-instituted change relative to continuity. It is evidence that while the period included minor periods of Puritan reforms, the primary change of lasting continuity was a socio-economic transformation of feudalism into an early form of capitalism. This continuity is acknowledged alongside the aristocracy's securing of political and social continuity with the monarchy, Anglicanism having their social position secured for centuries following the Restoration. It is therefore concluded that the era represented a duality of temporary change and change leading to continuity of socio-economic trends, political systems, and cultural and religious institutions. The author is making a sophisticated argument that the small changes instituted by the Puritans actually led to a continuity of events, that events were leading up to this continuity anyway, basically. Now, this is the 100-word plan that the author brought in with them, and this is what you have to bring into your essay as well. Now, in this case, they have a brief notes about the events and dates. Then they have the reference and what the reference said. So Hill, Carlin, Gardner, Maclean, Gregg. Okay. So this is how they have arranged their notes, the plan. And of course, they also included a bibliography, alphabetical, and in the correct format. Okay, so make sure you have that. Now I'm going to compare the essay to the assessment criteria. Okay, now the first assessment criteria refers to the historical context. Okay, and if you look at the very high level here, discusses with detail the chosen historical context in terms of significance, defined time frame, and specific place location. Okay. There is a very clear paragraph about historical context in the essay that we just went through, which relates directly to this select assessment criteria. Criteria 2 refers to change, discusses complex aspects to comment on the importance of significant change, considers and supports evaluation with a wide range of sources at a complex level to account for change. So there are several paragraphs in the essay regarding change. It discusses the interaction of groups, which leads to the complexity, and it supports the discussion with references. The third selection criterion is about continuity. Same thing, there are specific paragraphs devoted to continuity, and there are sources to support the analysis of continuity. So there are in-text references. Criterion 4 refers to the structure of the essay and referencing and language. Okay, so this essay is a good example because the language used is quite sophisticated. The references come from, there is more than one reference used, and it is a logical essay with clear paragraphing and a clear introduction and conclusion. Criterion 5 refers to having a wide range of accurate and complex information from academic and critical sources, presents a bibliography with at least 5 academic sources, and submits a structured essay plan. So Criterion 5 refers to the bibliography and the plan that you hand in after the exam. Okay, and you get 5 marks for each criteria. So you can see Criterion 4 and 5 are mainly about how you write the essay, while Criteria 1 to 3 are about the content of the essay. Now, I hope that discussion of an example has helped you clarify what you need to write, and comparing it to the assessment criteria hopefully has shown you how you can obtain good marks and meet what's required for the exam.